Thanks for all of that sessions. What a tough one to follow up. So it's great to meet everybody or, be presenting here today. We're really going to be speaking about the concept of M365 Governance as it's going to participate in Copilot Success. Now, I'm picturing a lot of people are sitting here and being like, hey, who is AvePoint? I thought I was showing up for an F12 event. I was excited to hear from the F12 folks, and I'll definitely be able to answer that. What happened was we're really excited to be partnering with F12 because they partnered with us for a lot of expertise when it came to moving data inside of M365 and managing it thereafter. And they're such fantastic technological strategists. And they kind of approached us with the idea of wanting to make sure that we can bring a lot more speed and efficiency to establishing and maintaining governance for their customers as they're going through this Copilot journey, as it's such a pivotal piece in what makes Copilot successful and honestly secure on a regular basis. So that's really what we're going to be diving into today. We're going to be looking primarily at really what are the considerations we want to have when we're thinking about launching our own Copilot and AI strategy. And that's going to break down into various forms of both consolidating your information and your data into a way that Copilot is going to find it useful and usable, making sure the data actually contributes positively by reducing redundant, obsolete, and trivial data, what I'll refer to as raw data from now on. And then how we start establishing data governance in a way that's not going to be intrusive to our end users, but it's going to be effectively highlighting areas that could expose some risks, as well as finding a way to automate a remediation process around much of that risk as well. So we're going to explain what governance means and what it matters in the context of Copilot, so you can ultimately roll out with confidence, knowing that there's not going to be any barriers to your success in your usage of Copilot that would be the result of just an impromptu strategy rather than a well thought out and designed strategy here. And here at AvePoint, we have been working with Microsoft and Microsoft technology for so long, which is why we've been invited to speak today. We've been working with Microsoft since the early 2000s, I think as early as 2001, when SharePoint was on its earliest iterations. And we've grown to over 2,000 employees with a huge global presence. And what I like to let everyone know is that, Microsoft gives us quite a lot of accolades. We're actually up to 6 Partner of the Year award wins very recently, which is why our slide's a little bit out of date. But that's why we're so excited, is because when Microsoft makes a huge pivotal change like it had in Teams, which was a huge Nexus event, we're now in the same position that we were there to help our customers and our partners really be able to make the most out of that journey. But what is Microsoft really saying about Copilot and the way that you might want to be rolling out? This is literally a slide that Microsoft had actually provided to AvePoint, and it breaks down this strategy here. You want to make sure you're identifying what you want to accomplish from a business, what your technology roadmap, all of that here. F12 is amazing at all of these pieces. Like I said, we were privileged to be able to work with them on all of this today. But where I like to highlight things is the AI governance piece. That's usually the thing that takes quite a lot of time and nuance and kind of creates a little bit of speed. But the reasoning behind why we even need governance for M365 to improve Copilot is what I'm going to be getting into right now. So I like to harken back to this slide where it gives you an examples of your first 10 prompts or use cases out of Copilot. And I want everyone to notice a very specific theme that is corresponding out in the slide and all of these prompts. It is either going to be generating some amount of data in the form of files, texts, recordings, what have you, or it's going to be accessing some data to reference it when we're thinking about Copilot for M365. And it's going to be accessing your data, your company's data, the data with inside of M365, and wherever you point Copilot to get you those answers. And that is exactly the thing that we want to make sure we're controlling, so it's both effective and secure. Access to your employees, as well as when they do access the data, they're accessing the right data. And that's that idea, right? Copilot, all of these examples, everything that all these organizations are building out as far as use cases go, it's obvious that this is going to be an extremely transformative project that any company is going to be having here. But the one singular problem as it relates to what actually exists inside M365 is there's a lot of data to manage. And it keeps growing, and more data doesn't always mean much better results for AI. It doesn't always mean more secure results. We want to make sure that data is always positively affecting the business at all junctures within AI's context. So let's take a few examples out of these data challenges that we've gotten from Gartner and industry reports and bring out a few statistics. The first thing I want everyone to understand is, yes, your data is growing exponentially here. On average, across the thousands of organizations that are surveyed here, about 1.7 megabytes is generated every second by a user base inside of M365. And even beyond that, it's already been proven difficult to find information that we need, which is something everyone's looking towards Copilot to solve. But one of the biggest things that I like to highlight for everyone is that whenever we're talking about M365, over the short timeline of this survey, 40,000 permissions, access points to files were created, and those files actually were identified to be capable of causing a lot of damage if leaked or put into the wrong hands. Catastrophic damage was the term the actual report was using. And that's something that really needs to be understood as far as what are we doing to make sure that we're controlling all of those features and all of that access as time goes on, because that's something that Copilot can use. And then there's also this idea, and this is why we're very excited to be able to help with all of F12's amazing work for their customers, is there's a sentiment there's not a clear strategy on what to do with AI. There's ambiguity in what you want to be able to accomplish and how you're going to be able to get there. And it makes sense. If we even just look at governance, which has been identified by organizations like McKinsey as being one of the main things that is contributing to a higher likelihood of success with AI models, governance itself is not an easy issue. I want to take people back to the ancient history of 2023, which does feel like ancient history in the age of AI, and really think about this in the form of, hey, what actually was everyone's opinions on governance? And everyone thought just M365. Collaboration technology had a big impact on organizations today. It was really important, but all of the IT leaders as part of this Gartner survey back then, almost the exact same amount of people and percentage said that they didn't really have what they felt they needed to support a governance strategy for M365 systems, all the data around here. And really, it was the feeling that the traditional approaches to managing data for M365 didn't feel like it was enough. And that had some ramifications, right? Of course, organizational leaders want things to be quick, fast, easily accessible, and they really need employee experience to be good so that they can be effective in meeting business objectives here. But it was the security, compliance, and legal-minded people that was really thinking like, we have to do that, but we also have to make sure these spaces are completely fortified. And there's a very difficult juxtaposition between those two opinions in this case, but I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to be as daunting. Microsoft, whenever they're talking about this issue, they like to say, hey, just take a look at your permission models that are available in M365 services and SharePoint to help ensure that the right users, right groups, they all have access to the right things. That way, you're not going to have any problems when it comes to data leakage, and there's not going to be a lot of exposure in a lot of these cases here. And when I ask organizations if they could help me understand, or if they could describe their existing permission models, I only ever get head scratches. It's not an easy thing a lot of time for people to articulate how their permission models really work and how they review and manage and change these things over time here. And what is huge and what Microsoft does all the time is they always focus on the expected benefits because they're going to be so powerful. They want to show us images of all of these really, really attractive people with a background of hip hop music, getting to deeper and more relevant search results, actionable responses that are directly available to everything that they need at the time and exactly what they're asking. They want to make sure there's huge protections and they're going to see an explosion of creativity, but the considerations that people are bringing along the way that really need to be on everybody's mind as they really start to think about the ramifications about such a powerful tool being able to create so much data and create so much access and availability to our information is, what are we going to do about the increased storage costs that are going to be involved with this? How are we going to create information and guide it so it's consistently both available, but not going to be diluting our effectiveness with that data? How can we make sure we're complying with not only today's data privacy laws, but the ones that are going to be changing and developing as the result of this transformative technology? What are we going to do about the security and compliance? How are we going to consider this as we're thinking about our own privileged information, our intellectual property? And then how are we also going to be making sure that there's no barriers to the adoption of this expensive tool? How are we going to make sure that it's ultimately going to have the impact that we're looking for? So at Point, we work in frameworks, and this is the approach that we're hearing for an actual governance strategy that's going to come in pages. Everyone's in a different position. Sometimes the first focus is going to be preparing, just making sure your data is where it needs to be. And I'm going to touch on that next, on what that really means and what that means in the context of Copilot, which feels like a catchphrase that I'm bringing out quite a lot nowadays. And then we're also going to be speaking about what's a lot of people are going to be grounding themselves pretty immediately on is, hey, how do I make sure that I have a secure environment before I unleash such a powerful technology? This is the biggest thing that most people want to focus on. This is the first step, even though we put it in the middle, because we can bring our data in over time and have plenty of time to do it, but security is going to be the biggest thing. We want to make sure we're not under fire. And then what can we do as users? How do we use this framework to start optimizing our business through the power of AI? And how can you as champions really guarantee to your stakeholders and your leaders that you've come in with a delivered strategy that's going to make sure that they don't have some advanced concerns whenever you bring up, hey, I think we could get a lot out of this AI tool. All right, so let's jump in to the idea of data consolidation. And what I want everyone to take a look at, this is Microsoft's shared responsibility. What it ultimately depicts is there's going to be a lot of AI models that you can use. But ultimately, what you want to make sure is the focus here is that your data belongs in a place that Microsoft can build that envelope, that bubble for you when it comes to that data. Earlier, definitely Dante and Brandon have boasted about the power of Copilot, which is true, is the fact that you're not exposing your prompts or your questions, your results to other organizations through the power of the internet with Copilot. It's a beautiful thing. As long as you are using Copilot for M365 in the context of your business here. So what that means is essentially the data that Copilot's being trained on, that's being accessed within M365, is going to want to be inside of Azure. Because if you decide to kind of put it into an unprotected, unmanaged service that not either a Microsoft partner like F12 or even Microsoft themselves aren't providing there, all of the responsibilities from plugins, application infrastructure, security, model training, that's going to be on the end organization. You can't use all of Microsoft's experience and power to provide that here. So you want to make sure that you usually can have your data in a place that's going to be hyper accessible to Copilot. That's usually going to be Azure, meaning M365 as a whole. And what we can also mention here is no matter what, policy creation and control, data security and governance is at most a shared responsibility, meaning Microsoft is giving you a few levers to pull that you can ultimately control it, but the design and the implementation and the process that is either hyper manual or automated through your help really is on the end user. Microsoft is really only going to guarantee that it has the accountability for the modeling that's not going to expose your information outside. It's still on yourselves to make sure you're controlling the usage of Copilot inside of your organizations as a whole. So what this ultimately means is you're going to want to start putting information, consolidating what you think is most business critical to you, the data that's going to be relevant and actually helpful for your business into M365. It's going to be a part of our migration. And we have been partnering with F12 since I think the early 2020s to make sure that we have an efficient and effective process to make sure your data is both organized and accurately placed inside of M365 so it can be effective from any of the repositories that you're running into, which is really important to note in many of these cases. But what's useful with partnering with someone like F12 through that process, because many people are still on their on-premise file structures, is yes, we recognize there's always going to be some challenges with migrations. And that is going to go into the form of any kind of data identification. What do we actually need? What's the timeline that we're going to be able to execute upon getting our information in there? What's the technology that we actually are going to be adopting first and going to be strategizing around? And then what's going to be our even capacity to make sure that we're going to be able to do this and ultimately make sure that we have the valid content that's going to be relevant to our business now that we're becoming a little bit more cloud centric, so that we can get the benefits of AI. And what's fantastic is I've been mentioning this quite a lot is the process that 12 puts together is they want to make sure that they, one, can analyze all of those sources, make sure they can assess and execute and pilot the process of migrating so that it is effective. And at the end of the day, you just get to wake up and be inside of M365 at the end of this project without having to worry too much about where's your data and how I'm going to get to it. That is what they've built out, and it's very powerful and effective. And what it's really going to be focusing on as well is, remember, once you're inside of M365, your data is going to grow. We want to make sure you're set up well from the get-go within M365 so your data is accurate and helpful to your business and ultimately improving your lives. But the thing that ultimately becomes here is your data grows a lot. The fact of the matter is, for the majority of organizations, whenever we look at the vast amount of information that we're keeping, there's only a little bit that we need to keep and a little even less that we actually end up using. The majority of information that we end up is either trivial or redundant rot that essentially would be in our OneDrives or SharePoint sites, things that we don't touch, things that we don't need, versions of documents. And the question I usually ask that gets people really thinking about that is, if anybody in this whole meeting has actually ever managed to delete their data in OneDrive, you must be one of the most organized people that I've ever known. In my organization, my own desktop, I have been working at AppPoint for a long time. I haven't deleted a single file because we have policies that do that, for one thing, but honestly, it's because I don't think of it as a task that really would bring me a lot of benefit within my general job. And not only do we not know what we're going to need, what we're going to want to reference in the past, that's going to be a huge thing within SharePoint if we're just taking it out of the context of OneDrive. So the effect that a lot of organizations have, even if they've migrated all of their data super effectively, where it's completely accurate to the most contemporary business needs that we have, it grows so quick that you need to make sure that you have some sort of policies that essentially automate that process for removing this information. Because Copilot accesses info to get you the answers that you want from it. So if you ask Copilot a question of, can you summarize my 2023 results of Project X? It might give you a Project X from every single year part of the company, depending on how you controlled access and data as part of this. And that's going to be continuing. The exponential growth, that 1.7 megabytes per second, adds up across your user base. And you want to make sure you're recycling or removing information from Copilot's grasp. So summarizing the real issue into what we want to do with rot is, the fact of the matter is there's going to be a lot of data that Copilot accesses it. And the integrity of that data is going to dilute the effectiveness. So what we want to do is we want to find it. We want to find the information that you don't actually need to use. And we either want to delete, and that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Again, we have no idea what we actually feel like we need, but we all have this feeling that we need it. And we all have the feeling that our end users or our contemporary employees, everyone that we're working with, they might not feel like they want to delete anything. They don't want anyone to delete it for us. Well, that's the beauty of this. We can just remove this information outside of M365, but put in place a way to bring it back if we do need it, as if it was there the entire time. Just bring that back in a restore link so you can have that reassurance that, hey, if I ended up actually needing something, I can get it back, no problem, as if it was already there in M365. It's just going to be a little time between now and then that I'm going to have, but the idea is we're removing information that isn't going to be necessary. And that is going to be through a brilliant service that they have powered through our solution called Opus, where they actually take a look at the reports and build out a rule set and criteria that makes sense to you, that really would indicate information isn't going to be very powerful for you today. It's not going to contribute to helping you out. And we're going to build out an automated way that hits that criteria and takes that data, moves it into someplace outside of M365. So it's an arm's reach away, and Copilot cannot touch it or access it. And therefore, the results that Copilot actually gives you are always going to be something that's a lot more effective and actually accurate to what you're asking it. So it's not going to be a waste of return or a waste of investment in these types of cases. But the biggest thing that a lot of people like to think about, the first thing on their mind always does end up to be security. And that's the idea of what is Copilot and what is AI doing to make my information less secure? What would help me understand that problem? And I want that solved because I want to work on Copilot without having these anxieties. This is the step two, but again, a lot of people start with this approach. And I like to think and make sure that everyone that might not be aware of what Copilot's doing has an idea of what they are actually putting inside of M365. When you are syncing to OneDrive, that means you're syncing to M365. It is available to it and it can start spreading across the organization. But what is this data? And the fact of the matter is, when we ask someone, what is the sensitive data you're most guarded about, they almost always bring up personal identifiable information, credit card numbers, things of that nature. But all of the compliance regulations they'll touch on in a quick second really do think about things that salespeople have access to. People always think about legal, HR, any sort of compliance organization as the ones we need to worry about. And the IP goes to the developers or the product manufacturers, what have you. But no one ever thinks about the huge amount of count lists that we always end up putting in Excel. Salespeople are exporting your accounts, all of your customers' information into Excel at some point, and they're either saving it to their OneDrive or their computer in a way. It is just a very common practice within sales. Those are the things that we start sharing. Those are the things we give to people, and both through like our share links, through Teams, inside of SharePoint. That is where those things eventually go to when we're thinking about cloud adoption in this case. So think about your data and think, how comfortable would I be of some sort of outside organization getting and seeing all of our different product strategies or marketing strategies and knowing everything that we're going to be doing. And that's really what we like to focus on here. Is it's not as easy to focus on what's exposed, and we always have a little bit more exposure than we think. As this relates to AI, Microsoft definitely had something to say, as you could assume. But really what they take a look at is a lot of people are concerned about the way the data are leaked. So essentially, users might be leaking data to these AI apps inadvertently. And it is easy, and we're going to get into the ways that data can be made more available. But ultimately, the process that is in that scope of concern is that there's too much data oversharing. Too much data has way too much availability that hasn't been touched, hasn't been adjusted based on what that sensitivity might be. But the third biggest consideration is, what are people going to be doing with that data when they access it through Copilot? What is the actual effect of that data access, and what are people thinking and what are people reacting to when they actually get this information? A story that we had from one of the customers we worked with is someone did use Copilot to actually ask if the company was considering or going to go through with any kind of layoffs in 2024. And they did get an answer. They were told departments, quantities, titles, and what had actually turned out happening was Copilot was actually accessing data from 2020. Way too old for anyone to actually have it. But what did that employee do with that information? They probably panicked. They probably told a couple of people, and then that did have some sort of effect on the end business or morale or what have you. And why did that data need to be there, and why was it available to that end user still, is what often happens. That's the question when these situations do come up. And the biggest thing, and what a lot of people are starting to understand working with organizations like F12, is that this is a manageable situation. It's not something that you have to be overly afraid of. And a lot of people are thinking about this. Organizations are concerned about control when we're thinking about Microsoft's thousands and thousands of companies that they surveyed. And a lot of people are concerned about these upcoming regulations in 2027 is what they're scoping out to be, of when things are going to be like concerned about what AI is actually doing with some of our information in regard to privacy laws. And it does make sense because, as I'm sure you could assume, the great nation of Canada has actually started proposing a bill and drafted something that's going to start affecting the way that we're both using AI and how we're controlling our data, called C27. I do recommend a lot of people do some research. I'm going to touch on the parts that actually matter to Copilot and M365, but it comprised of three main bills that both establish a new privacy commissioner that's going to be governing any sort of fines or regulations surrounding this and actually enforcing things. It's going to be improving upon the PIPEDA standards, the Personal Information Privacy and Electronic Documents Act. And it's also going to make sure that essentially we have something specifically designed to identify and understand what data is contributing to AI strategies and how that's going to affect the people that we work with. So when we're thinking about compliance as it directly relates to M365, we know that there needs to be some sort of privacy management program. You need to be able to respond and understand and answer questions about what data exists within your communication systems today, whatever you're using. You have to have a general understanding or be able to find out what information is going to go inside of M365 that has relation to your employees, your customers, and your vendors. What phone numbers, what email addresses, credit card numbers, any sort of things of that nature, routing numbers, bank numbers. And in addition to that, you also need to be able to indicate and provide that information that has been contributing to decisions you're making through AI. If your Copilot or your AI tool is accessing some of this information, this bill is proposing that you have to know and be able to tell the organizations you're working with what that data is. And then finally, you also want to make sure that in the event of a breach, you actually know the scope of what has been breached and what has been actually accessible to those orgs. And that's a big one, because you have to, if you do actually end up as a part of a breach, which is extremely unlikely with someone like F12 really guarding the rails from the external side, and especially if you start working on that governance strategy, you're going to want to know exactly what was destroyed, what was brought out, what was dragged, because you're going to have to tell the people that are contributing to that. You have to tell the organizations that were affected by that leak. And if you can't confidently explain exactly what was leaked and exactly what was provided to whatever leak situation that happened through a compromised identity or what have you, then you have to tell everybody that you work with. Those are the rules now. It's quite literally anyone that you work with, whether they be vendors, employees, or customers, you have to explain that data was lost and you don't know what it was. But it was possible that it was there so that they can start planning. And there are, of course, going to be fines. So what you need to do is you need to make sure, one, I would recommend meeting with some sort of lawyer or attorney to get these enhanced consent requirements, making sure that you have those forms and those websites that say, hey, we're going to be collecting some data. Just wanted to let you know, and this is what we're collecting, and this is what we're using it for. But the bigger part here that we're going to be able to focus on is being able to develop a privacy management program and transparency and data use and security measures. And the reason that you want to do these things and the things that F12 can actually do for you is because 3% of the previous fiscal year's revenue. That is what you could be looking at if you accidentally had exposed some of this information, which is fairly substantial to many people. It is capped at $25 million, but I haven't heard anyone that said they didn't need $25 million. So I can say that's a bigger part here. So that's essentially if they can, and that also opens you up to getting your own damages claimed. Of course it does when we're thinking about lawsuits in this particular case. But I have talked a lot about the consequences of exposure. Jack, what are you talking about when you're actually meaning, what is my data exposed? How has this actually happened? And let me break that down for everybody today. In the past, outside of the cloud, we had Active Directory, which basically just meant there was a person in between access to data and the data itself. There was always someone that was a gatekeeper to that could review and could control that completely. But in an effort to make sure we could collaborate across the world effectively and quickly, Microsoft made sure that they gave that power to the actual end employees, the non-technical people. We are in control of our own access to files inside of our organization through M365, and it's wonderful. You're supposed to be able to do that. You have to be able to share files with your employees, your colleagues, your external collaborators. But what does that sharing really, really do? So let me break down an example. This was a template that I created today. Don't worry, I'm not exposing some sensitive information from that point here, but this is a fake marketing strategy that I decided to create a share. I created a copy link. But what does that copy link really do? Well, it creates access, obviously. But what kind of access? If you haven't actually deactivated this feature, the first thing that it could be doing is actually creating an anonymous link, which just means you created a link that will exist in perpetuity, unless you have some sort of policy that AppLink could provide for you, that is always going to have access to anyone that could get to it. That means if that email was actually sent to your mother-in-law, she could access it. If it was actually sent to your direct colleague, of course, they could access it. And it also means that anyone that link is shared with outside of your organization or outside the organization that it was shared outside the organization, a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, they could access that link. they would be able to get to that as well. But let's say we turn that off, which we do recommend. I would check with either F12, your service provider, or your IT staff if they have cut that off, because that is one of the biggest things that you can do to secure yourselves when it comes to your collaboration technology. But let's say we actually just cut off external, just everyone within the organization. That's a link Copilot can use. That essentially means anyone in my company can see this. If I shared out whatever M&A document, whatever direct marketing plan to my direct colleague or my direct report, then actually it turns out anyone in the organization, whether they be from our company's support team or from even just finance or legal, anyone can access that link if they actually get to it. And Copilot can go directly to that link and get information from it if you ask a question that it feels that data answers, which is where the layout probably came up. That's where somebody probably shared through an inappropriate thing that gave access way too many people not realizing what they were doing, and it ended up being able to be accessed by Copilot. And then even if you are doing it to specific security groups, large groups of people that you set up inside what's called a distribution group, that's hey, sales@adpoint.com, that's everyone in the sales company. We don't know often how often IT or who is actually controlling who is in and out of that organization. Are they removing licenses? Are they moving people out of those sort of things? So it creates a kind of blind access. And even when you share directly, then you don't actually know how often that file is going to be adequately provided here. So it actually just creates an access point that's a little bit more difficult to see, especially if it is to some sensitive information. So that's what a direct share, that share button inside any of your applications does. But let's take a look if you just want to use it through Teams. Let's say I just decided to share and drag and drop something into one of my colleagues' areas there. What that's going to do is it's going to create a share link through OneDrive. That's a direct share. But if I bring it to a whole channel, it doesn't only just create all of the shared links out of my OneDrive, it actually puts it inside of a SharePoint site and provides access to everyone inside of that channel. And it could be unique permissions if it's in a private channel as well. So walking through a scenario, I'm working on my marketing plan here. I'm doing this myself, but I decide, hey, I want to send this over to my boss. And then that created a OneDrive link share. So that's one specific location that is available to. But now I know it needs to go to the greater marketing team. So I want to hear what they have to say. But the marketing team says, okay, this is way too privileged information here. We want to make sure that this is a private channel. But what happened? 3 separate copies. 3 separate access points, all to various people and members of each one of those places, was actually created from that cause. And if any one of them uses Copilot, they're going to be able to access that file or the information within that file to get some answers. So if I ask Copilot, and I have nothing to do with this project, hey, what's our marketing strategy for 2025? It could probably give an answer if any of these shares actually turned out to be ungoverned or uncontrolled or cut off from any of those members, if they just happen to be a member of those SharePoint sites or channels in a lot of these cases. Realistic scenarios, but I want everyone to know it's extraordinarily manageable as long as you start to put a strategy in place. And what we're going to be able to do, and what F12 has been able to build a service around, is really making sure that we can build out a map of all of your data. Take a look at a broad strokes, what actually exists inside of your environment, and who is it available to both internally and on the external users that you've made. And we're going to be able to lock that down. So we're hunting for obviously the information that our regulators are most concerned about, that PII, PCI, anything to do with PIPEDA, or if you're working with companies in the States, HIPAA, and then GDPR if we're worried about the European specific data regulations as well. But we can also focus on more articulate information based yourselves as a business. And we're also going to be able to bring that down to make sure we're controlling the users that should have access to it. If we see anything inappropriate, we're going to be able to lock it down. We're going to be able to start putting some expiration dates. We're going to be able to see and be notified when problems start to arise. And we're going to look at the way that collaboration exists at your organization today and control it so it's for the better. And we're going to be able to provide a direct deliverable. This is something that as far as my call to action here, are the folks at F12 are able to actually provide this to you, even through a limited capacity, but their whole service will break down a whole heat map of where these situations exist today inside of M365 for you. And they're going to be able to tell you how it got there and who had access and all of those great things that you're going to want to know as you're going into a Copilot journey. But they're going to put in some policies in place that are going to prevent this from happening again. IT governance, M365 governance isn't a one-time project. It's a process and procedure that you put in place, that you automate, you prevent risk from happening again once you've actually solved it. We don't want to be inefficient. We don't want to double up our work. So let me summarize everything that I just mentioned and where that service context is. The problem that we're looking at when it comes to security is going to be that Copilot ultimately leverages the information and the permissions it has available through the graph. So that just means when you share something, Copilot can also access it for the person that's asking for it if they have access to that permissions. And the way that you provide access is pretty wide and pretty broad based on the way that you're using M365. Just the usage of Teams or that share button creates a lot of lines of access, depending on what you're doing, that can exist in perpetuity. But what we're going to do is we're going to find where those situations are there, and we're going to focus on data that shouldn't be accessible, that shouldn't be widely available to the organization. And we're going to make sure that that's only available to the appropriate users in the appropriate spots, and have a process to know and be notified whenever that data is generated outside of the places that we can control. And then we're going to be able to locate and eliminate those things. We're going to cut off any of that inappropriate access proactively here. So by working with F12, you're going to have a combination of effects. And this is what you as champions can do. You can focus on the benefits you're going to get out of Copilot rather than having to bog yourselves down on, hey, what are all the considerations? How am I going to make sure I'm super secure? Because there is this templatized process here. You can bring your data in, control it, and make sure it's organized. You can keep it organized by consistently removing the data that isn't going to be needed after a period of time that you've judged that it isn't necessary, but make sure it's not destroyed, and save some money across the process. And then additionally, you're going to be able to identify where these exposure situations might be happening through the use of your collaborative tools. And by doing so, we'll have a framework in place for you to be able to control that through M365 Governance and data hygiene, so that you can go forward and make sure that your governance and automated process there really optimizes your experience within M365 and your experience with Copilot, so that you are actually getting those business results that Microsoft promises there. And it just turns out that you have out of nowhere, you've had your own hip hop music backdrop as you're going through asking people to create your new gaming script, even though we all might be actually asked to draft up emails and maybe summarize some meetings in the meantime. But hey, I'm not here to tell you what to do with Copilot. I'm here to tell you what Copilot can do to you, but we're here for you. So I definitely encourage anyone that is curious around IT security for Copilot, that wants to start seeing some use cases, loop yourselves in with your technical account manager at 12, with Brandon, with any of the folks. You can ask me directly at any point as well. And we'll make sure that we'll get you the answers that you need, facilitate some use cases, and make sure that you're secure and adopted. So, I mean, that's my time here. I'm going to pass it back over to the F12 folks, really just showcase to you exactly what are the capabilities that you can get out of this tool, and make sure that you ask any questions, and I'm here in an open book for y'all.
Awesome. Thanks so much,